Classical ethologists were never overly concerned with behavioral development because they felt that everything was innate. And so there was nothing to worry about in development. Behaviors would just happen, so why bother studying them? Well, of course, I'm talking about what people believed back in the 1930s, 40s, maybe a little bit thereafter for the most part. But you know what? They had an exception that they felt was interesting and worthy of studying, and in fact, investing a great deal of time studying. And that's the phenomenon known as imprinting. When we talk about imprinting, we're basically talking about the development of social attachments. And this is something that they felt did require a specific form of early experience in order to develop. For those animals where such behaviors did not develop innately. Now, two types of imprinting were classically distinguished. Filial imprinting, where a young animal is actually forming an attachment to a parental object, having been exposed to that object, and usually it would be the mom, a maternal object. And sexual imprinting, which is a form of early experience where you form an attachment to a particular object of some sort. Hopefully it would be a member of your own species. But then you would wait till sexual maturity to then engage in the behavior that would actually show that you are in fact attached to that object. In other words, trying to mate with it. Sexual imprinting versus filial imprinting. You could look at it methodologically like this. So we have a young animal, we have an old animal. Well, an adult, not old, not super old. So for filial imprinting, you take two objects. They can be any objects you want. They can be junk objects, they can be real objects, whatever. Okay, so I'm just using like a stuffed jungle fowl model versus a box with stripes on it. So you expose a young animal to either of those. Doesn't matter which one. Well, it actually does, but we'll cover that in another segment. Then you isolate it from that object after you've exposed it to that object, and then give it a test between the object you exposed it to and the object it's never seen before. And if it has in fact imprinted on the object you've exposed it to, then it will show a preference for that object. It will approach it, it will follow it, whatever your test happens to be. Now, sexual imprinting, you do the same thing. Expose it to one of two objects, but the isolation period is much longer. So now you're going to wait for the animal to reach adulthood and then give it a test between the object it was exposed to very early in life and the object it's not seen before, and see which one it shows a mating preference for. So for a filial imprinting experiment, it would go something like this. So here we're exposing in an arena a newborn duckling to a rotating model of a mallard hen. It just rotates around that arena. Okay? Then after a period of isolating it from that object, maybe hours, maybe a day, whatever, depending on the experiment, you give it a test between the hen and a cube on the other side, and they're slowly rotating around. And so it would look something like this. So it's following the hen, because in this experiment, it was exposed to the stuffed hen. Had we exposed it to the cube, you would see it following the cube and ignoring the hen. So imprinting works. It works really well. It's a very easy thing to demonstrate. For a sexual imprinting experiment, okay, here's a zebra finch hatchling, and it's going to be raised by Bengalese finch males. So yes, you can cross-foster the egg. So you're going to put the egg of the zebra finch in the nest of a Bengalese finch. Bengalese finch will take care of it. It will feed it after it hatches as if it's another Bengalese finch, but it's not. It's a zebra finch. Then you wait for it to reach sexual maturity, and you give it a test between a female Bengalese finch over on the left or a female zebra finch, its own species, over on the right, and in fact, it will choose the species to which it was raised. In other words, the Bengalese finch, courting the Bengalese finch right there. And you can do the opposite. It works both ways. You can take a Bengalese finch hatchling, have it reared by zebra finches, and then give it a test when it reaches sexual maturity of the zebra finch female over on the left or the Bengalese finch female over on the right. And it will choose its foster parent species, the female zebra finch, and ignore its own species, the Bengalese finch, and indeed even try to mate with this stuffed model of a female zebra finch, trying really, really hard. No offspring will be produced from this copulation. So let's look at some of the historical aspects of the imprinting phenomenon. It goes way, way back in time. Pliny the Elder in 27 AD, actually in his many anthropomorphic writings, wrote about a goose that followed a man around. And basically, I guess what had happened is somehow it got imprinted on humans very early in life, and now that's what it wants to be around. So you'll find that in one of his many, many writings, Pliny the Elder. First description we're aware of an imprinting-like phenomenon. Of course, the word was not around back then. St. Cuthbert, moving ahead in time, was a protector of wildlife. And as such, he tried to domesticate animals by first getting them tamed down, which is a necessary step toward ultimately domesticating an animal. If they're not going to be tamed, then they're not going to be around humans, and you won't have a chance to do selective breeding. And so what he did was to imprint young wild eider ducklings, which we see here on himself. And indeed it worked. They formed an attachment to him, and they became very, very tame. I don't believe he ever domesticated eider ducklings. I'm unaware of any domestic breed of the wild eider duckling. But nonetheless, this is something that he did write about. Sir Thomas More, this is really, really interesting. Sir Thomas More, not an ethologist, not a scientist per se, but rather an author, and his most famous work is this. And unless you read Latin, you won't know what that is. Here is the translated version of it right there. Utopia by Sir Thomas More. Now, in this book, we find the following passage. Of course, I'm showing it to you in English translation. They rear a very large number of chicks by an amazing device, for the hens do not sit on the eggs. Instead, they keep a great number of eggs warm with an even heat, and so hatch them. As soon as the chicks come out of the eggs, they follow the men and recognize them as if they were their mothers. He is basically describing the imprinting phenomenon, the filial imprinting phenomenon. The amazing device, it could be anything. By the way, this is a photograph, and so obviously it doesn't go back to 1517. It's in the 20th century sometime. This is in Egypt, where eggs are placed in a cave-type enclosure where the heat is pretty evenly distributed. It's pretty warm. And then this Egyptian, he is not sitting on the eggs to incubate them, by the way, but he has to come in and check to see the development of the embryos, if everything is going well, and all that. So that's a pretty amazing device in a way, but obviously he is foreshadowing the modern incubator, a truly amazing device. Now, Sir Douglas Spalding, no wait, just Douglas Spalding, I don't think he was knighted. Douglas Spalding, in 1873, and we've encountered him, by the way, in another segment, was dealing with chicks, and actually domestic chicks, but I'm just using a picture of a wild jungle fowl to make the point. So what he did is he put masks over their heads so they couldn't see anybody, right from the time of hatching up to and including the third day of life. And when he removed the mask and they saw a person, they showed no fear of the person. He tried other objects as well. They didn't show any fear, and in fact, they readily imprinted to whatever it was they were exposed to, as long as the mask was taken off before 3 days of life, or at least no later than that third day. But if he waited till after that third day, what happened when he removed the mask is they wouldn't imprint. They, in fact, were showing fear of whatever objects they were being exposed to. Basically, what he was talking about here is what we now call a critical period, and we're going to have an entire segment on critical periods. Oscar Heinroth ultimately became the director of the Berlin Zoo, and basically he was like Konrad Lorenz's mentor. So he's the first one to use the word einzupragen, meaning to imprint, or actually it means to stamp in. But in imprint, think about the seals that they used over in Britain. I'm not talking about animals. I'm talking about the wax seals, right? And they have this thing, and they stamp it in the wax, and it gives the seal of the royalty or whoever's doing the stamping in. Basically, they are leaving their, guess what, imprint to stamp in, einzupragen. So ultimately, that got translated into imprinting, just the noun form, by Konrad Lorenz, which is Prägung. And that is basically imprinting. So that's how we actually ended up with the word imprinting, from einzupragen to Prägung, translated as imprinting. So here's a film that Lorenz made. It's a rather old one, actually. So these are goslings that he obviously imprinted on himself, and now he's stuck with them. He has a whole new flock of friends, as it were. That kind of thing, by the way, can backfire. Just, oh my God. Now, Lorenz believed that imprinting was different than other forms of learning, and he based this on the following reasons. He felt that it's a delayed response. And by the way, for that, he is specifying sexual imprinting. So there's no argument about that. So you're going to form an attachment to something early in life, but then you're going to have that long period. Remember the methodological definition of sexual imprinting, that period where you will not be showing any sexual responses yet, because you haven't reached sexual maturity. You may, by the way, not be isolated from that animal unless it's being done in an experimental setting, in which case you would isolate the animal from the original imprinted stimulus. But basically, you would wait till you reach sexual maturity to then see whether or not you are showing a sexual response to it, sexual imprinting. So there's a delay between when you encountered the stimulus and formed an attachment to it to the time that you actually are being asked to respond to it, in this case sexually. So, okay, no argument there. However, there are arguments here. He said that it's irreversible. Once you form an attachment to a stimulus, it won't be reversible. You cannot then form an attachment to another stimulus. Well, since he claimed this, because this was all in some of his earlier writings, there have been many studies to show that it's quite reversible. And in fact, some studies even show double imprinting. You can imprint an animal on one object and then let it go for a while, imprint it to a second object, double imprinting. And just outright reversibility as well, by the way. So, okay, that one did not hold up. Supra-individual characteristics. He said, you don't form an attachment to Konrad Lorenz. You form an attachment to a higher class of individuals, i.e. humans. Supra-individual, above the level of the individual. That's what you're actually forming an attachment to. Now, we're going to visit that in a later segment. Critical periods, back to that again. So this is, again, one of his defining characteristics that kept imprinting separate from other forms of learning. He said you can only imprint during a particular time of life, during a critical period. Well, you know what? That is something that has made its way into a variety of literatures. It actually started in experimental embryology in the late 1800s. But then after it got part and parcel of the imprinting literature, people started applying it to language development and all kinds of other things. So we're going to cover the critical period nonsense in a separate segment. And, it's not entirely nonsense, but there are some huge issues there.